Hey guys, I'm Lucy Walker and today we're going to take a look at bezel setting for rose cuts and cabochons. Now cabochons, or cabs as they're known in the trade, are actually a single domed surface, usually with a flat or, in some cases, a slightly domed backside to them. Now traditionally, opaque or translucent gems were cut as cabochons, but you can find any gemstone as a cabochon these days. Stones with special effects, such as moonstones and opals, are generally preferred to be cut this way because they actually show the stone's phenomena much better when cut as a cabochon. Rose cuts are one of the earliest faceting styles of gemstones. They also have a flat back, but rather than a smooth domed surface, they have a series of traditionally triangular shaped facets that come to a point at the top of the gemstone. Now the term rose cut these days has got a lot more vague, but there's no denying there's still a really cool gemstone cut to work with. Now if you want to know where we buy our rose cuts and cabochons from, check out the resources section for a full list. So we're going to be making this pendant from a combination of sterling silver and fine silver. We're going to be using fine silver for the bezel because it's a little easier to push over the stone. You can absolutely work in sterling silver too, but if you haven't done it before, you'll just find that fine silver makes life that little bit easier. So we're going to be working in commercially available fine silver bezel wire in 30 gauge, which is just over 1/4 millimeter thick. We're also going to be using some 18 gauge sterling silver for the back plate. You can also work in 20 gauge if you prefer. You're going to also need some 18 and some 20 gauge sterling silver wire, and finally solder in medium and hard. Oh, one more thing. You're definitely going to need a gemstone. Either a rose cut or a cabochon will work perfectly for this. If you haven't done any bezel setting before, I definitely recommend going for a more even looking stone rather than an odd shaped stone or one with corners to start with. But don't worry, we will cover all those tricky little buggers too. Now because we're using pre-made bezel wire, we are restricted to the heights that we can purchase. But let's take a look at the ideal height for a bezel before we get started. Bezels work because a thin layer of metal is pushed over a stone to secure it in place. It's a relatively easy setting when using a thin bezel, as long as we get the height of the bezel correct. When looking at a stone though, to judge how high we want to make that bezel, we aren't looking at the height of the stone itself, but the point at which it starts to curve. It's quite simple with a stone such as this. The stone starts to curve right at the base. However, many cabochons don't look like this. If your stone has a much higher dome, then the bezel will need to be much higher too. We need our bezel to be very slightly higher than the point at which our cabochon or rose cut starts to curve. In all honesty though, every stone is different. So let's just say approximately 0.5 to 1 millimeter higher than the point at which the stone starts to curve over. So I'm going to be working with a rose cut stone today. They're super popular at the minute and they are one of my favourites. Now my stone is about 4 millimeters high, but it actually starts curving over about halfway up the height of the stone. So if you add on 1 millimeter to that, then we've got about 3 millimeters. So I'm going to start with this bezel wire that's about 3.5 millimeters high, so we'll be able to file it down later before we set the stone. The best thing about using this thin, fine silver bezel wire is that it's ridiculously easy to form to the right shape. Now just before I file, I'm going to give it a little squeeze between my flat nose pliers just to make sure that the end's not deformed at all. So I'm going to use my barrette needle or escapement file to file this, and I'm filing in the direction of the height of the bezel. If I try to file across the height of the bezel, then this happens. A neat little trick here though is if you have a pair of parallel pliers, use the pliers to line the bezel up with and file across it to get that perfect 90-degree angle. Or you can also use one of these super handy little tools called a miter vise. But in all honesty, they are fantastic, but it's a good idea not to rely on them because in some cases you won't be able to use them. So it really is a good idea just to work on accuracy to start with. So there we have it, a nice flat edge that's 90 degrees to the length of the wire. To form the bezel, all we need is the stone and our fingers. I'm just going to wrap the bezel wire around the stone as tightly as I can, making sure to keep things nice and level as I'm doing it. Then, where the bezel overlaps, I'm just going to draw a line with my Sharpie. I draw the line right at the point of the overlap, not before the overlap, otherwise my bezel will be too small. So to cut through the bezel wire, you can either use a pair of shears or flush cutters. But remember, if you're using flush cutters, that only one side of the cutters actually cuts flush. I'm going to use my shears because why not? I'm going to cut just to the waist side of the line so that I can file it back as necessary. I know that if I cut directly on the line, I'm going to make the bezel too small. So once cut, I'm going to check it against my stone, and as you can see, it's slightly too large, which is perfect, as I'll need to file the end flat anyway. Now, it's no drama to open the bezel up again here at this stage if it helps you file the end perfectly flat. If that works for you, then go right ahead. I'm just going to file this by holding it against my bench pin, but absolutely you can use the parallel plier trick again to get that perfectly flat and perpendicular edge. So now let's just form the bezel back around the stone again, and there we go, a perfect fit. If it's just a fraction too small, don't worry too much about that. We have a trick for you on that later. For now, it's time to solder. So before we solder our bezel closed, we need to make sure that the edges are in perfect alignment, and we need to make sure that they stay that way. So you do have to handle this very carefully. So we need to check that everything's aligned this way, this way, this way. This takes a little bit of doing. We don't need to worry about the shape at all at this point. We can change that later, just as long as our edges are in perfect alignment. So once it's looking good, a neat little trick here is to take a pair of flat nose pliers and just squeeze directly on the join from both sides, just to make sure that my edges are lined up perfectly. And there we go, all ready to solder. I am going to very carefully now just pop this down on my charcoal block. Now, if you want to see how we prepare our solder for use, check out the video in the resources section. But if you haven't done any soldering before, I highly recommend going back and checking out our Chunky Chain online class. We're going to use hard solder to solder this closed. So to start with, cut a super small piece of hard solder. Mine is about 1mm by 1mm, and place it down on your soldering surface. We're using charcoal today. Very carefully flux your join. You don't want to be aggressive here, as you can easily mess up the alignment of the join. And very carefully place your bezel down so that the join is sitting directly on your solder. The solder must be touching both sides of the join here. Alrighty, now just for shits and giggles, let's see exactly how easy it is to melt a bezel. Okay, the torch was moving way too slowly. So let's take a look how to do it correctly. In order to solder without a total meltdown, we need to be heating the entire bezel evenly and keeping that flame moving reasonably quickly at all times throughout the entire process. Seriously, don't let it stop dancing for even a second. Only at the last moment, when the flux is clear, can you focus on the front half of the bezel, but still keep that torch moving. And now we're just going to quench it before popping it into the pickle.